Welcome back. So we're going to talk about the last part of these precursors to modernism. And remember, we're still looking at folks playing with moves towards abstraction, getting out in a different way in urban environments, and in particular, finally recognizing the impact of art from other continents on Europe. So Japanese woodcut still a major influence. If we look at Art Nouveau, which in French literally means new art, and the Secessionists, there's some serious overlap. The Art Nouveau and Secessionist style are particularly famous for their use of lines. And Art Nouveau is going to focus on really curvy, sensual, sinuous lines. One of the pioneers of this style, part of the old Whistler circle of aesthetics, right? Art's pretty, not deep, focusing on pretty instead of emotion, is Aubrey Beardsley, who's famous for designing posters and book illustrations. This is probably one of his most famous pieces, the peacock skirt. And Beardsley died so young that he's really trapped in this one style his whole career. He's famous for being interested in these real black and white basic prints. And he's going to associate those curved lines with a sort of decadent and erotic style, which a lot of Art Nouveau artists will. Another of the great printmakers is the Czech gentleman, Alphonse Mucha. And Mucha is going to spend a lot of his career in Paris while he works as an illustrator, particularly for advertisements and posters. So he's famous for his posters of the actress Sarah Bernhardt, and you see one of those on the left. But the advertisements in the center and right give you a sense of apparently how high quality ads were at the time. Mucha pioneers those real sensuous lines, particularly with flowing hair, that are going to make a comeback in the 1960s with psychedelic concert posters for places like San Francisco's Fillmore. But he was initially very much famous for those curvy women. Later in his career, he goes back to Czech city of Prague and creates a famous epic of the history of the Slavic peoples. But these are still what we think of for Mucha, and you wouldn't think a cigarette ad more than 100 years later would still be wildly popular, but you'll definitely still find posters for things like this, and they have a huge influence. The curvy lines that influence printmaking, advertising, posters, and illustrations are also going to influence other types of art. So we see it in glasswork. Louis Comfort Tiffany was the child of a jeweler, and he's going to bring the Art Nouveau style into glasswork, probably the most successfully and in a way that's still pretty popular. He studies painting, he works in interior design, and then ultimately he opens a glass studio based on things he's seen in the UK and parts of France, where you have folks like Lalique working. He's going to pioneer new ways to blend color, and he's going to also experiment with various metallic additions and play with different types of acid to get light in this sort of trippy iridescent color that you see on the far right here. Those are two lamps from the Tiffany studio with the designer Clara Driscoll creating them. Tiffany creates his own lamps, but his studio of designers follow that same style. Notice the curves of the base of each of these lamps. Those bases are absolutely Art Nouveau as well. And notice the vininess, particularly of the wisteria. We see Art Nouveau emerging not just in glasswork and painting and printmaking, but we see it in architecture and interior design. One of the more famous is Hector Guimard, who's active in France. And he's famous for controversial metro stops, which are pretty iconic still in Paris. I decided to give you an example of one of his houses so you see the sort of decorations Art Nouveau looks at. Notice that not only do we have curved lines, but a lot more asymmetrical work than some of our previous styles, especially the classical works that imitated Greece and Rome and tried so hard to keep symmetrical temple style work going. The asymmetrical element, for example, of the front gate here of the Castle Béranger is absolutely pulled from the perspective of those Japanese prints that are so fascinating to Europeans during this period, that they're finally learning from and appreciating another culture. Guimard had a rough life because after World War I, when Art Nouveau declined in popularity, he had a hard time finding himself with the more strict, straight-line modernist architecture. Other artists just did whatever they wanted for their entire careers. Gaudi, who is a Spanish artist or a Catalan artist, if you are a giant advocate of Catalan independence, certainly don't want to offend anyone here, is lumped in with Art Nouveau artists because of those sensual lines and the fantastic element of his art. But he does a lot of his own thing. Probably his most famous work is the Sagrada Familia Cathedral. And you can see the cathedral up close here. It was started in 1882, and Spain had a rough 20th century, and it's an incredibly expensive thing to fund, so they're still working on it. But the Holy Family or Sagrada Familia Cathedral is an example of the style of play that these Art Nouveau artists experiment with at its finest. If you look inside, he famously is designed, this is looking up at the ceiling, the nave, the main sort of hallway body of the cathedral. He's famously designed it to reflect a tree of life with the columns as branches in a forest. And you can see the heavily decorated outside. He's clearly pulling on the Spanish traditions of the Baroque that we looked at previously in this class. But notice how fantastic the leaves are. This imitation of nature, right? Again, not completely symmetrical. Lots of curves, not the cleaner lines for Greece and Rome, are showing us how modern he is while he's still cognizant of the past. His artwork is all over the city of Barcelona, but I want to show you real quickly one of the private homes that I think is absolutely stunning and gives even more of that sense of play that Gaudi has. If you look at the Casa Batlló, you'll see it has these incredible rainbow roof tiles on the exterior that give it a look almost like, if any of you have seen the children's book Rainbow Fish. No complete matching parallels. Notice the windows in particular on the left side don't necessarily match anything exactly on the other side. He's not afraid to push boundaries. And that sense of pushing boundaries, pushing towards something radically new, is getting us ready for the 20th century and what we call modernism. Austria in particular loves Art Nouveau, and there it's often associated with the secessionist movement. The secessionists, just like secession in, say, the Civil War in the United States, are literally breaking away from the old art academies in order to follow this more Art Nouveau style. One of the most famous of the architects is Otto Wagner, who creates Maiolica, right, a word for pottery, house in Austria, which is one of the most famous of these Art Nouveau buildings. Look at the incredible ceramic tiles on the exterior. Pay attention to how the actual line of the flowers dips and curves across the front, almost like a garland. And look at how sensuous and curvy and vine-like each of those tiles is when you examine them up close. Now, Wagner's important in an architect who crosses many periods, but the most important of the buildings associated with the Secessionists and Art Nouveau in Vienna, the capital of Austria, was Josef Maria Olbricht's Secession building, because this is where the artists kept their exhibitions. Here you can see that he uses much more symmetrical, clean lines at first, But look at how he's added plants to the exterior. Can you see the narrow trees at the corner of the building with the leaves crushed in under the roof? He's got messages. Notice the sign asymmetrical to one side of the entryway. And in particular, look at the globe of leaves on the ceiling. This is like something straight out of a William Morris made into sculpture. And those incredible laurel leaves made into that round front and the beautiful detail work, that curving vine, is what keeps this from being angular in a way that crosses over into modernism or something more classical. He's very clearly keeping to those more sensuous and curvilinear shapes that define Art Nouveau and secessionists in general. One of the most famous of the secessionists, artists is Gustav Klimt. And sensual is usually the word applied to his work. He does a number of high society portraits and more fantastic pieces that he arranges with models. But in general, what he starts with is human beings, sometimes landscapes, and they quickly turn into sort of fantasies. Klimt's painting at the same time that Freud is writing, and a lot of people look to his work for some sort of deep sexual psychological insight. One of his most famous is The Kiss, and the way the couple is bundled together, the awkward but emotional positioning of the bodies, has made this an incredibly famous piece. Both of the pieces on this slide are from his gold period, where Klimt was basing things on Byzantine mosaics and the gold tones of Eastern Orthodox art. But notice when you look at those vines, when you look at those asymmetrical circles, how much he's staying true to those Art Nouveau themes, even while he's experimenting with an idea from essentially the Middle Ages gold icons. A painting that's grabbed more attention in recent years and has always been very popular in Austrian art since the Second World War is the portrait of what's sometimes called the Lady in Gold. Her name, however, was Adela Bloch-Bauer. This is one of two portraits of Bloch-Bauer, and she was a society wife in Vienna. The painting is absolutely beautiful, and in both of these paintings, I wish I could show this to you in person, because Klimt's basing his work on Byzantine mosaics, Byzantine icons that are set with jewels or glass tesserae, mean that he has incredible texture. If you could run your hand over a Klimt, you'd find little metallic pieces and areas where the paint is thick, almost like Van Gogh, and other places where it's incredibly thinly applied. Brushstrokes totally varying depending on what texture he wants to convey. Unfortunately, digitization doesn't give you as much sense of that texture as I wish. You might get a little bit of it if we zoom in on Adela Bloch-Bauer here. Adela Bloch-Bauer happened to be a Jewish woman, and the painting was stolen from her family during the Second World War and taken into Austria's national galleries. There was a massive court case that only ended in 2006, and the painting was eventually brought to the United States, where it's now available to see in New York. Fabulous mystic Egyptian eyes tucked in there, by the way. I hope you're noting those. All right, we've done a lot for the late 1800s. So the last we're going to look at here is another secessionist to remind you how much printmaking is part of the game. So in this case, one printmaker from Austria who's part of the movement and a good friend of Klimt is Coleman Moser. We have one of his pieces. Note that long Art Nouveau hair flowing, just like something from Mucha or Beardsley on the right. And Moser is part of a wider movement because the secessionists are so well organized. They actually want to create an entire way of living. They want you to have their paintings, their clothing, their furniture, their architecture. Moser is part of what was known as the Wiener Werkstätte, or a workshop that created everything from silverware to furniture to tapestries for your home to give you a complete secessionist lifestyle. And he founded this with the secessionist named Joseph Hoffman. This is just one example of a cabinet Moser designed. Notice the women on it who look a little bit like something out of Klimt. And this would have been in a bedroom, probably to hand clothes. Just like the secessionist building, it's a little more angular than some of the other Art Nouveau pieces. But at the same time, we have these real dreamy figures with sweeping lines of their dresses in the center. I'm hoping you enjoyed Art Nouveau and Secessionism. Hoping you're remembering how much new mobility, new types of paint, technology, competition with cameras. So instead, this new emphasis on sensuous lines gives us movement, and how much the influence of Japanese artwork after the emperor opens the country up, part because he's forced to, are influencing art globally. We will talk more and head into modernism in our next videos.